Welcome to Popternative, where we dive into topical discussions from the worlds of pop culture, social media, and sports. Here is your host, Peter Remoliotis, aka PD Beats.
PD Beats here from Popternative, speaking to composer Tree Adams, known for a lot of really cool work, specifically his work on NCIS New Orleans, and now most recently NCIS Hawaii. Thank you so much for doing this, man.
Great to be here, Pete. Thanks for having me.
You know, it's interesting because I always get excited to do these interviews because I'm starting to interview more composers here and there, but I do a lot of, actors, writers, directors, a lot of that. One thing I don't feel like they talk a lot about is they have, obviously auditions and everything, but composers, it's the deadline game, right? You always have the deadlines. And that's something that will get never old for you, right? The deadlines is a deadline game.
Yeah, well, these things have air dates. So you gotta write the music before it airs. We also have our own version of auditions too. A lot of times we have to do these bake-offs against each other, and you win some, you lose some.
Oh, absolutely. Does it blow your mind, the process of, because different shows, I'm sure it's different in terms of deadlines, or when are there some projects you need to get the music in way in advance, or some it's more kind of like last minute? Like, what does it depend on the project?
Yeah, it depends on the project. I think a lot of times you want to create a sound for the show if you can.
Yep.
And so then it's good to get in there early and create a bunch of pieces for them to kind of work with and use as a springboard for other ideas. And so in the case of NCIS Hawaii, I did that. I wrote like 100 pieces of music in a kind of conceptual stage. And then, people could play with them in editorial and say, oh, that feels like a good theme for that character. And you sort of find it as you go. And
what was the transition like in terms of, because you did New Orleans, and you wrapped that recently. What's that transition like? Because it's obviously they're NCIS shows, but they're completely different shows. Maybe is the music completely different? Like, what's that transition like? I'm curious about that.
Well, I think because of the show, the NCIS of it all, it has a certain format.
Yeah.
You have obviously like car chases and shootouts, and you have, crime scene stuff and exposition as they learn about the case. And then you have the interpersonal relationships, whether that's poignant or lighter banter stuff. But I think what we're doing with both of those shows was to sort of honor the region, to use players from the region, and to try and imbue the score with a little bit of that flavor. So in New Orleans, we had a lot of horns, we had a lot of kind of band sounds, bass guitar, drums, some percussion that was sort of like found percussion with like maybe a little bit of like a Haitian influence, like mbiras, and that was, and then a certain style of writing. Some of that stuff would be more swung grooves, and we would inject some of that into that same structure I'm talking about, those same bones.
Yeah.
Now for Hawaii, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to honor the culture there, use regional instruments and players, and to try and put money in the pockets of local people there. And, so we're using a lot of the Polynesian drums, like the ipuheke and the pahu. We're using ukulele kind of in a different way than one normally would, where it's sort of not like, major chords like happy strumming on a beach, a little pedal steel and, some of that kind of thing, and making it feel like the region. So that, because part of what is fun about watching these shows is kind of getting to go there.
100%.
You see Hawaii, or you're on the streets in Bourbon Street there, and Frenchmen, or it's fun to kind of be in those regions. So
100%. No, absolutely. And I do have to ask, because you also did the music for the 100 on the CW. And I just recently interviewed Richard Harmon, who played Murphy on that show. We were talking about the shelf life of that show is non-existent. Like, I feel like people will just keep going back and watching those over and over again. That's kind of, I feel like, happening a lot now with score music. I'm seeing that a lot, especially with streaming services like Spotify and everything, where the access did you notice that a little bit? That scores, like the access of scores and the listening of scores, increased a little bit as well, Tree?
I think so. Yeah. I think, it's part of the storytelling, what I mean, when it's done properly. For the 100, that was Jason Rothenberg's show. It's one of those. It was one of the most streamed shows. Like if you look kind of in the history of
Huge.
yeah, and it's got kind of a mad, loyal fan base.
Yeah.
And a lot of great opportunities to create themes. I've written a lot for Murphy right there. You were and I think when the music is part of the storytelling, it just enhances the experience. It's another layer for people to enjoy and immerse themselves in that world.
Yeah.
And certain shows are more, they really lend themselves to kind of like people wanting to dive in,
Yeah.
You hear people talk about like the Marvel universe or,
Yep.
the NCIS universe they've been talking about lately with me. And I'm like, yeah, sure. It's a universe. Come on in.
I'm curious because obviously, you're doing more of the scores, but I'm curious just from someone who's been in the industry for a while, you were seeing a lot of, those like Broadway musicals going to the big screen, and you're seeing, there's talks about the other way around where like there's musicals that were big, they adapt them obviously into Broadway productions and everything. It's a lot different than what you do because you're doing a lot of the scores and everything, and they're actually like there's vocals and they're singing and they break out of the song. I'm just curious if what you think, someone that's been doing this for such a long time, writing music, what do you like about the current state of the musical a little bit, whether if you work in it or not? I'm just curious because I feel like it's exploding right now, and the adaptation from being a TV show to Broadway and back and forth, that's crazy to me. And again, the soundtracks are huge. So I'm just curious what you think about that world, that universe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a natural progression for any good story or good piece of intellectual property to kind of go across platforms. You know what I mean? Video games, whatever, And I think, that we're going to probably see more of that. Like if there's some good IP, it's going to, flourish in all these different formats. As far as making things into a musical goes, I mean, look, that might work for some things and not for others.
Yeah.
I'm not, I sing and play in bands and stuff. I've never really done a lot of work in the musical category.
Yeah.
I have friends who do. And I'm not sure what makes a project kind of primed to be a musical.
But that's why I asked you, because you're not in that. I just wanted your opinion.
Yeah.
Like your raw, basically opinion of it.
Yeah. I mean, and look, if you'd asked, before Hamilton, like, would that work? Like, I don't think people would think it would work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Huge hit. So, I'm not sure what goes into the calculus of making a musical hit.
It's interesting though, because but like every time there's a big epic that comes out, whether it's the NCIS, the 100, or these big movies like the Fast Saga and everything, there is this focus on what artists are going to be in the soundtrack, but what's the score? Like I am seeing that, to be honest with you. I feel like when I was younger, you had, of course, like the Hans Zimmer and the Shores and the big ones, and those are the ones that we're focusing on. I'm seeing that completely different now, where people are waiting for the score. People want to listen to it. I am noticing that, like, honestly, like from being someone like who's very into researching a lot of stuff, I'm noticing a shift in that for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's what I've always kind of enjoyed, It's storytelling with music. I mean, that's kind of what drew me to it. Mm-hmm. Obviously there have been soundtracks for years where they're featuring artists,
Mm-hmm.
and songs play a big part in a lot of these stories. And putting together a good soundtrack of artists is its own art form that music supervisors, are diving into. And it can do a lot I remember, growing up, there were movies like, I remember like The Big Chill was like one where they brought together like all of the hits from that era, and it was like this nostalgic piece. Or my friend G. Mark Roswell Gilly, he was the music supervisor on the Commitments, and that was an interesting one where they put that band together and that became a big thing. So I mean, that's its own column as well, of interest.
I do want to ask, because I said on the top, people don't know the life of a composer as much as they do of like an actor or a writer or director. You know what I mean? I brought up the deadlines right away. I mean, the shows have air dates. You gotta get the music out there. What is something you can tell us about the life of a composer that people might not know about? Maybe it's specifically a TV music composer. Like, is there something like a misconception? Is there something that you're like, hey, Tree, it's like this, right? You're like, nope, it's the complete opposite. Is there anything you can tell me in that regard?
Yeah, there's probably a couple things. I mean, I think first off, you may think that the composer, that it's entirely like their vision is what ends up being the final thing. But because it's a collaborative sport, you have to understand how you may have an idea. And at the end, you're going to be the one standing there being like, yeah, this was my idea. But you have a lot of different processes to go through and a lot of different people to appease. And you need to figure out not only what's best for the show, but like what's probably going to make it through.
Yep.
Not just with the person who's your boss, but the network who's going to be giving notes, or the test screening that's going to happen when they get audience reaction, and all the different people who may weigh in. So there's a lot of navigating there to do.
Yep.
And that's an interesting aspect of the job. And if you want something good to end up in the end, it's not just like, oh, I created something good here, it's going to go all the way. You need to work with all these other aspects of it. And the other thing is that, and every composer works differently, I think, but you often have to have a team supporting you. And you need to kind of build a machine.
Yep.
And I, prefer to like not take on too many projects so that I actually write it all myself.
Yep.
But I can't do this without my team.
No.
I've got somebody who's, doing all of these different tasks so that like I can kind of create what I've got. And then that vision, like I still can see the forest for the trees when I get to the sort of final point where we're mixing it. And I can still, like, I haven't been bogged down in all of these other, thousands of bits of minutia. And so you have to, build the proper team to get you through.
Yep.
And that's another big part of it too. You're kind of a field general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think people don't like, they see, music by Tree Adams. It's like it's a team. Like it's a big process behind it.
Absolutely.
Which is huge as well. Do you have any advice for someone? I mean, maybe like music composing specific. I mean, just musician, because you're a musician as well, right? You say you played in bands and everything. What's some simple, quick advice on top of your head for someone who's trying to break into the music industry? And I say this probably because I used to be a concert promoter and everything. Break in properly. What can you say to someone who's trying to get into music and trying to get out there, like advice wise?
Well, I mean, there's all of these different ways in. I mean, it depends, do you want to be in the musical theater? Do you want to be in a band? Do you want to be a film and TV composer? If you want to be a film and TV composer, I think the best way to get in is first to understand technically your way around some of these programs, Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase, what have you.
Yep.
And then I think it's really about getting on one of these teams, being behind the scenes on one of these teams, supporting another composer who's working. Because I'm sure they teach, because I work with a lot of kids who come out of Berklee School of Music or USC or whatever, the great film programs they've got. And I'm sure they're teaching a lot of these things. But unless you're in it, doing it, you don't understand what's going on. So the only way to do it, understand it, is to do it.
Absolutely.
So that would be kind of my advice on that.
I just feel like it's so true. Like I have a marketing communications background, more from a sports. Like I started in sports, and it's just people always ask me, like, how do you get into it? You just have to figure out a way just to get the opportunities, go in there, but I feel like research is a big thing too. Kind of, that's why I like what you said, Pro Tools and everything. Like you really have to like take the time to like research the landscape, what it's like. I think the research thing is a big thing. Like that's a huge important one. Yeah.
Well, because also if you don't put in that work ahead of time, you are not going to be prepared to jump in and be of use to anyone.
Yep.
But B, also you don't understand what it is you're trying to get into.
Yep.
You know what I mean? a lot of people, they start learning the composing thing, and then they're like, I don't really want to be a composer. I'd rather be a music editor, or really, I kind of want to be a producer. I want to produce hip hop beats, or I really just want to work with singer songwriters. You kind of got to, get your hands on it, get your head around it.
The unpredictability and the going with the flow aspect of things too, Trey, I'm sure happens. Like, I mean, there might be a chance that someone you've worked on a project or someone on your team, right? If you go and have like a chat with them or go have like lunch with them, they'll probably tell you, like, to be honest with you, I didn't think I was going to be like composing music. You know what I mean? That's another thing too.
Yeah. I mean, and you never know where the opportunities are going to come from. Yep. I mean, one thing that's been really fulfilling for me is I've had a lot of people on my team go on to kind of have their own careers and, be doing their own movies and shows. And that's really great to see. And, I'll get a call after someone worked with me for 5-6 years or something, and they'll be like, in some, whether it's like a negotiation or some kind of like weird political situation that's come up on a project. And they're like, hey man, how do I get through this? And it's really fun to kind of like see that happening. And, it's a bit of an apprentice based kind of business.
100%. Tree, I wanted to thank you so much for taking some time and coming on Popternative. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pete. It's been a pleasure, man.
Absolutely. So NCIS Hawaii, they're going to be able to look out for that and your amazing music, because like we said, right, deadlines, right?
You know it. Every Monday, baby.
Any social media they could follow you on? Keep up to date with anything, or?
Yeah, I'm up there on Tree Adams on Facebook, Tree Adams 35 on Instagram, and I have this band Dagnastopus.
Yeah,
you can just find it with a name like Dagnastopus.
Yeah, you'll find it. Absolutely. This has been Popternative, youtube.com/Popternative for previous episodes, popternative.com for other content as well. Until next time, this is Tree Adams and PD Beats signing off.
Thank you for tuning in to Popternative. Make sure to check out our past episodes of Popternative on YouTube. Be sure to like Popternative on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.
This has been an Autograph Communications production.